Hello and welcome to another episode of the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, where we talk about leading teams, online collaboration, and working in distributed companies. My name is Pilar Orti. I'm the director of Virtual Not Distant, which is the company behind this show. And you can find out everything about us over at virtualnotdistant.com. And today I have a guest. I have a lovely guest. She's been on the show before, and I am really excited because I talk to her online a lot, but now we are in synchronous time. So listeners, welcome back to the show, Catherine Nicholson, who's the director at Virtual Training Team. Hello, Catherine.
Hey, Pilar. It's great to be here again.
Well, it's lovely to have you here. And you last appeared in episode 274, which was on the 27th of May, 2021. And we're recording this at the end of February 2022. So how have things been at the Virtual Training Team company?
We've been very busy. And we keep getting comments like, you were like in there first before, we're like, we were doing this before it was cool and certainly before it was necessary. But still we've been busy and we're working very hard because the truth is, Pilar, before the pandemic, we were a niche organization because not many people were specializing in virtual training. Of course, now every training company is a virtual training company. So that's made us have to rethink and stay on top of, well, how do we stay ahead of what we're doing? How do we do our best to pioneer new ideas and new thinking and use the latest research to keep moving forward? And for me, that's really exciting because we have to keep challenging ourselves to deliver new things, to do things in different ways, but then also as a team, how do we operate internally? So there's been lots of change, and lots of really positive stuff. And we're just super pumped about this coming year. Like, it just feels, I don't know whether you've got this feeling as well. Just everyone we speak to, everyone's like, yeah, this year, because we've been on hold, haven't we, for 2 years?
Yes.
Oh my goodness. And now it's like, okay, this is it. Let's do it.
Yeah, it does feel like that a bit, like there was a big pause button pressed and we don't know, we weren't unsure on when to release it. So yes, I agree. And you also work with internal trainers, is that right?
Yes, we do. So a big part of what we do at the virtual training team is train the trainer programs, which we've always done. But at the beginning of lockdown, you can imagine we had organizations coming to us saying, help, we're selling gene DNA sequencing machinery. And when we sell one of those machines, we need to train people on how to use it, but we can't do it in a room anymore. Help us. That's just one example. We had lots of organizations come to us to help us with the train the trainer. So we're helping individuals and teams within organizations to, well, originally it was making that shift from how to be a face-to-face trainer, a confident face-to-face trainer to a confident virtual trainer. And now we're getting organizations approach us saying, well, we've got people that have never done any training before. So can you help us learn how to train and then how to train virtually? We're also doing train the trainer programs that are like a hybrid between how can we train face-to-face and virtually and in a hybrid way as well. So that needs evolved. But now we're getting people that came along and did our train the trainer a year or so ago who are like, okay, that was great. We're really good at what we do now. What's next?
Yeah. Great. Well, let's pick up there because I think that's a point where, to be honest, just to take it a step aside from the training world and profession, I think that's where a lot of people are in online work as well. That novelty and that adaptation to the medium and that acknowledgement that we can work in this medium has happened, and now it's exactly there. Okay, we've experienced this. What next? I think everyone can probably relate to that. And listeners, if you haven't listened to episode 274, Catherine explains exactly I think a similar, if not the same example you gave us about how they helped people to transfer some technical training online as well. That was great. So so maybe you can tell us how you approached this new need of trainers coming and saying, our people are now used to talking online, they're used to meeting online, they're used to doing lots more stuff online. And if we stay with that place at the moment, what came next then? How is it? How have you approached those next steps?
Yeah, well, we always start with our need to understand, seek to understand first of all. And you're right, it was trainers saying to us, we've got used to this now, we can do this thing called Zoom and PowerPoint. But also participants, learners were saying the same thing. It's like, yeah, we've got it now. We're used to it. Because a lot of learners just weren't ready for that virtual environment of learning, but they've got it now. They've nailed it. And that's great. And we looked into it, and those of you listening who are into your learning science, there's this concept of learning loops. So when you're new to a particular type of training, let's use virtual training as an example, there's so much to learn of that new environment and that new way of learning. What really helps is to find a routine or a pattern of learning that it can become familiar to you. So a simple example is you go in a workshop and it's, let's do some introductions, let's do some context setting, let's ask everyone a question where they respond in chat. Now let's do a breakout conversation. Now let's come back and explore a case study, for example. And what then happens is if the next workshop follows a similar pattern, it's easier for learners to settle into that routine because they know what to expect. So they're not having to work hard around what's happening. It's like going into a familiar room or a familiar building. You're not having to think about where the fire exits are. You know it already. So that's great for a while. And then that familiarity turns into predictability. And it's almost too easy. People could become so familiar that they stop trying. They don't need to work hard to settle into that environment. So that's the point. And it's hard to know when that point is. And we actually don't know when that point is. You sort of get a sense of it. But it's like, we need to shake this up a little bit. But then the danger is you shake it up using, there's so many cool platforms and applications out there. And if you're like me, super curious, it's like being in a sweetie shop. It's like, I want to use everything. But that doesn't work either. You can blow people's mind with too much stuff. It's more a case of, well, what can we use that enhances the learning experience, that keeps it adapting, keeps it interesting enough to keep people engaged, but always still maintaining that purpose and the learning outcomes. So we're only using new things in a way that enhances the learning rather than just adds bells and whistles, which is far from what we need. There's enough bells and whistles out there.
So I'm really curious now, and I'm sure listeners want to know. So what is it? What is it then? And I think that's so interesting that we've gone to a place of, first, predictability can bring comfort and we embrace that. But when it starts to get in the way, that's when we start to address it. So how do you address it? How do you address it?
How do we address it? We from two different angles, actually. So one approach is we do allow ourselves to be that kid in the sweetie shop about going, actually, let's just create that smorgasbord of what's possible. So we have at VTT a whole 8-step process that we use to design workshops, programs, all of that. But it starts with the end in mind, first of all. So what's the outcome? What do we need people to think, feel, and do as a result? And always that's in mind. That keeps our feet on the ground, stops us getting overexcited. But then we do let ourselves get a little bit excited. I'm very easily excitable, Pilar, as you know. So then what we do is we do get overexcited in like a safe space by saying, well, what's at our disposal? What are the sweeties? We call them gigs. So a gig is an idea. It could be a concept. It could be a platform. It could be a story. It could be an image. It could be a process. It could be an activity. It could be a piece of science, but it's a thing that could be incorporated in some sort of training program. And we get overexcited and have ideally way too much that we could possibly use. So then we can move on to the next stage where we get all grown up and get quite ruthless and say, well, what must stay in? What do we need to have in order to meet that outcome? And if it isn't relevant or if it isn't necessary, even if it's really nice to have sometimes, we let it go. However, we don't necessarily let everything go completely. There might be a great model or idea or concept that there's no time to put it into the actual program, but maybe we can deliver that in a different way as part of the supporting collaterals or pre-work or supporting materials. So that allows us to get all excited, but then bringing our feet back to the real world to work out what must we keep in. So that's one way of starting really big. Another way is, and this often gets driven by clients coming to us to say something like, so one example is just a conversation we had yesterday with one of our clients where they said, one of the challenges we've got is in this particular training, which people get certified at the end, so they've got to pass an exam. As part of that, they've got to read, consume and understand a 67-page legal document. Sorry, I can't even say it, it's that boring.
Wow.
A 67-page legal document, which even if it's hard work to consume.
It's long.
Isn't it? It's long and you're reading it and you're taking it in.
Yes.
And so they've come to us to say, well, what ways can we help our learners consume the content? And actually, there's loads of things that we can do if we get creative. So this is a case of starting from the problem rather than the output concept. So, for example, do you want me to share a few ideas that we've been...
I think listeners will be fascinated, and I also I'm taking notes.
Well, one idea is to take a leaf from your book, Pilar, is to turn it into a podcast. So you could take the key concepts of the 67-page document, make them into a discussion that you record that people can then listen to on their dog walk. So they've got some idea before they go in and actually read the document, or they use that afterwards as a way of consolidating what they're learning. We've taken some inspiration from other applications as well with this idea of what we call learning blinks. And what you can do is, if you already are an expert in that 67-page document, it's to pull out what are the key points that people actually need to remember and take away. And then consolidate that into, it could be a recording, or it could be a document, or it could be a slideshow, but something that's like, these are the key points that if you know nothing, this is what you need to take away. And that's a great way of having people primed before they read the document. So it's not coming to them new. They're like looking for those things. And then it's a nice summary to layer the learning afterwards or to recap. And then even things like go find. So, you could say, somewhere in this document, there's a statistic, or there's a quote, or there's a piece of research.
I love that.
Where is it? And then, of course, you've got all your like quizzes and testing. So if you think about it, and one of our philosophies is we've not been beaten yet. There's always a way. There's always a way to make something work, to bring it to life, if we just get creative and if we explore ideas. So that idea of having to consume a 67-page document, you still might have to read it, but there are loads of ways that we can bring it to life and make it more digestible.
Yeah, that's great. I hadn't thought of that, yes, really giving those, when you look at this, look, what is this? And start to look for this. So also your mind is primed. And also, I suppose you're narrowing down those 67 pages, even in the mind of the person. It's like, okay, I'm going to be looking for specific stuff. I don't need to, you already, what you're looking for. And that helps understand the material. So what you're starting to describe as well is to really embrace, even when we are preparing interventions for training, and to tell me if I'm just reading stuff into it, but we're also going back to the concept of blended learning.
Absolutely.
Which now really we're probably going to get rid of that word blended, because it's just learning and we're using everything at our disposal now. So, but is that right? You're really using the real time, the async, the tech, this kind of tech, this other kind of tech, etc. You're really blending everything.
Yeah, and you can blend at different levels as well, can't you? Because I think we used to think of blended learning. Originally, blended learning was, how do we take our face-to-face learning and combine it with e-learning? And so that was it for a bit, wasn't it? And then it was like, well, maybe we can combine it with virtual. And then, like I said, now it's just, that's what it is. It's everything. And you can blend on a big level. You could take complete like onboarding programs or management development programs and blend the whole program. Or you could take a single workshop that's 2 hours long and do some blending within that. What happens before, what happens afterwards. We talk a lot about learning pathways that you can curate for learners as part of a workshop or a program, where they have two pathways. One pathway is required and one is desired. So you can create that learning. So it's like, actually, if you're going to go through this program, you need to read the 67-page document. That's part of what's required. But actually, if you're curious, let's curate some stuff for you, because there's so much stuff out there, Pilar, that I don't know about you, I get lost regularly in these rabbit holes on the internet. It's like, oh, and another thing and another thing. But actually, you've got to check this stuff out, because there's a lot of stuff that on the surface seems really interesting. But when you look at it, it doesn't have the rigor that maybe we need. So having somebody curate that for us and say, hey, if you're curious, here's some useful stuff as well, can be really helpful. So yeah, absolutely. Blended is the norm now.
I love that. And listeners, I also want to hear some input from you, although we do have listeners that I only find out they listen to the podcast like months after they've been listening, because I'm the same. I rarely reach out to shows, even those I listen to regularly. But listeners, this... it's now gone because I was talking too much. Required and desired. I love that. And I think that a lot of the times when we are either going through training programs or providing those training programs, that can really make the difference. One, between actually the people who are seeing it as a requirement actually go, well, I'm not having to do everything because I don't have to do the desired. So that's fine. Okay, bit of autonomy there, sense of autonomy there increasing. And for the crazy people like you and I who just would be in the gathering information and dreaming phase of learning forever, I think then it gives you that extra space as well. I love that. I really, really like that, the required and desired. And that's a really good approach for a lot of stuff also. That's really nice words. So thank you, Catherine. I'm going to steal those.
Yeah, it's yours.
Or borrow with pride, like another podcast guest said. I don't even know if the conversation will have come out yet, Ananyavish. So something though, so talking of requirements, there's lots of organizations where there are things we have to deliver as trainers. So I'm talking now from the internal trainer point of view, and I'm saying we as the royal we. But we receive the slides from the department that has put the training together, and then we need to deliver. And some of these slides, very similar to the document you were talking about, might have a lot of things that need to be in them. They might feel a bit difficult to navigate. How do you help people approach those, or how would you approach that kind of challenge?
This is something we see a lot, actually. So the challenge comes from a few different places. So just the first challenge I find quite a lot is, like a lot of organizations have the organizational branded templates that you can use for PowerPoint. The challenge that I see in that is often it comes from comms or marketing, not from a training perspective. And slides that work for a marketing campaign or an internal comms campaign don't necessarily work when you want people to engage, to learn in a different way. So that's one of the challenges. But then quite understandably, if you are delivering something very technical, it might be that the slides have been created by the science department or they've been signed off by the legal department. And sometimes that means we can't change them, or we're limited with what we can change. So where that becomes a challenge in the actual training environment is if you're a participant and you get this slide that's got all of this data or a complicated diagram or loads of bullet points in text, where do you look? It's information overload. And also as a trainer, how do you control where the participant looks? Now, the first thing I think that we can do here is understand that one of the reasons that the legal department or the science department, whoever that create the slides, do that is because they need to, from their perspective, they need to make sure that if it's on the slide, then the participants see it and then the boxes tick that they know it. But just because they've seen it doesn't mean that they know it, or that they can remember it, or that they will apply it. So I get why they do that. And so often what we do is we say, well, okay, maybe that all needs to be in the takeaway documents. So people have that. But in terms of what you visually present to them in a learning environment, that could be different. Either by taking that one slide and stripping it out and putting it into more slides. And by the way, I just have to say, because I've had this pushback a few times, certainly in a virtual training environment, having a lot of slides isn't a bad thing. You're probably better off having more slides with less on them than fewer slides. You want things moving without being too quick, but you want visuals moving to keep people engaged. So that's one thing. If you've got the ability to strip them out into more slides, great. But even things like if you're stuck, if this is the slide, you can't move away from it. You've got to live with it. Still, how can you control where participants look? So, for example, what you could do is you could cover elements of the slide. We call it hide and reveal to make it sound more exciting. But you could literally use shapes to cover elements of the slide, so people are only looking at the bit that you want. And even just the good old using a pointer or a laser pointer to say, this is where we are right now. Or even explaining to participants, okay, right, just before you jump into this, there's a lot of information. We're going to start in the top left-hand corner, then I'm going to guide you through. So stay with me, and I'll make sure that you are looking at the bit that you need to look at. But it is thinking about it from the participant's perspective. How do we make sure that they're looking at what they need to look at? They're not racing ahead. They're not getting cognitive overload, which is just too much. And so, we look at, well, what can you do if you can change the slides to make them more accessible? And what can you do if you're stuck? Yeah. But there's always something to make them better.
Yeah, I love the covering idea, covering with shapes and stuff. Yeah.
Well, watch out for this, because it's going to be one of our next videos that we do videos and put them on our YouTube channel. Bit of a plug there. But our next one that we need to do is that, because we found a way. It's actually, once you know, it's quite straightforward, but it took us ages to work it out, where you can cover elements of things on your slide. But, usually in PowerPoint, if you're using animation to move or remove things, you're stuck with the order of when you click your mouse.
Yes.
Whereas if you want a choice, if it's like you might want to say to your participants, okay, so say we've got several boxes covering different pieces of content and they're a different color. You could say, so Pilar, which box would you like to reveal next? And you say, I'd like to reveal the red box. And then I can do that. I can unclick the red box. And we'll show you how to do that, because it's a really simple thing, but it just gives so much control back into the session where you're not having PowerPoint dictate to you which reveal happens next. You can actually control it. It's a really nice little touch.
Yeah. Do you remember the address of your YouTube channel?
If you go into YouTube and just put in the virtual training team, you'll find us.
Excellent. Do check that out. I might put the link in the show notes. It really depends what my brain is doing on a couple of days. Catherine, something else that you were mentioning when we were preparing for this episode was how important, of course, the quality of the conversations that participants have in the sessions is important. What are some of your thoughts around that? So how can we help people have great conversations online? Let's stick to online for now. Or some of the things you've been experimenting with, and also, has your view of how these things happen changed at all? All of that.
Yes. So, well, let me take you back in time to when I first started delivering virtual training. The very first session that I ran was a disaster. It was a long time ago, thankfully, but the memory still lingers. But I was quite cocky and confident and thought, hey, I'm a great face-to-face trainer. How hard could this be? But the thing that I found most difficult, and even now, the thing that, when we're training trainers new to virtual training or less experienced in virtual training, their biggest fear is the tumbleweed moments. That's what hurts the most. You crack a joke or you ask a question and you get nothing back, and it really hurts. So what then happens is you find some ways of getting a bit of interaction. So rather than just asking a question like, is everyone okay with that? Instead you say, hey, if you're okay with that, put a thumbs up in the chat box or something. And instead then you ask questions with more purpose. So you might ask a question and say, put your answer in the chat box. And then I might say, okay, so Pilar, you've said that your experience of this is X. Tell me a bit more. Wow. And now we're having a conversation. Now, often, I've been through this, so I can speak with experience. What then happens is, as a trainer, you're so relieved that you've got a conversation going, that you think you've made it. Hurrah, we're having a conversation. But our challenge is, what's the quality and depth of that conversation? So we give ourselves a huge pat on the back because people talked, they were involved, they were engaged, and we had a conversation. So when you start to, again, look at the learning science of how people learn, we know that the deepest learning and the longest lasting learning and the learning that's more likely to be applied in the long term is where we're thinking harder, we're thinking deeper, we're analyzing things, we're making connections with what we already know. And that often means that as a trainer, we need to ask questions that challenge the thinking. And actually, a slight tumbleweed moment is often a good thing, because if you ask somebody a question that makes them stop in their tracks and go, oh, I really need to think about that, that's great, because they're really thinking about it. But we can't do that as readily in the moment as we can in a face-to-face environment. Now, and we've all been there. I confess, I have rocked up to face-to-face days of training with like a few flip chart pens in my back pocket, and that's it. I'm good to go. And you can fly by the seat of your pants. And, you can do a little bit of that in the virtual space as well. But it's much harder because when you're delivering virtual training, there's a lot to think about. You've got a camera on you, first of all, which you're supposed to be looking into while somehow, subtly glancing at your notes at the same time and glancing at the videos on the screen of all the other participants. We've got the chat box. We've got the participant reactions. We've got our slides. We've got all of that happening, our tech, and we're supposed to be like performing at the same time. Of course, it shouldn't be a performance. It's real, but you know what I mean? And I often describe it. It's like learning to drive a car and being expected to sing at the same time. Yeah. That's really hard. So in a virtual environment, what we always say is just think about your killer questions in advance, because it's really hard to just think of them in the moment and then be brilliant. Think of those killer questions that are really going to provoke thinking and get people to think at much deeper levels. And then you're having conversations that are much richer.
Yeah. And going back to the massive silences, which always seems so much more daunting online than when you're in the room together. I also think I've learned to embrace them as well. I mean, they are horrible because you're like, are they not speaking because they're thinking? Are they not speaking because they want to go? Why? What shall I do? At the same time, I don't want to force them to speak. Maybe they don't want to speak, and that might not be a bad thing. And I think that, yes, preparing for those also, and knowing and accepting that those moments happen, and instead of just letting them happen and deciding in the moment how to deal with them, be prepared for them as well, like with the questions. Yeah, I suppose we go back to the online space where everything needs to be a lot more deliberate, and it just requires that much more thought. Yeah, that's a lot of stuff. Excellent. So I think you've already you're already touching on this whole preparation and just a little bit of anticipation, because there's something else I wanted to draw from this conversation is these conversations that we want to enable as trainers and lead as trainers. Maybe they are similar to what managers might want to do when they're talking with their team, when there is in the context of meetings specifically. Do you think? Well, okay, I'm not gonna ask you a leading question because that's terrible training practice. But so, what do you think of this, Catherine? What I'm thinking is that there's a lot that we can apply around this. There's a lot around. Okay, well, let's find the moments where we can suggest that we go into the chat for a little bit of a rest, but also let's suggest the moments where we don't use the chat so that we don't have too much stuff going on. What else do you think that managers or people leading a meeting can take from this practice?
So I think the first thing to consider is we're now having conversations that we've never had to have before. So whether you're a manager having one-to-one conversations with your team, virtually or in person, or running hybrid meetings, virtual meetings, even just the topics of conversation that we're having, they're conversations we didn't used to have before. We're having much more personal conversations and sensitive conversations. And so a big part of that is, if we're talking about being in a meeting, if you're running a meeting, it's so important, isn't it, that we create that psychological safety, that people feel that they can speak, people feel that they can share without judgment, without people having opinions, or without it going anywhere else as well, if it is a sensitive conversation. And that's something else I think we need to do intentionally. So that the whole thing about trust sort of builds over time, everyone says, but sometimes we haven't got time to wait for that trust to build. We need to make it happen. So that could be about setting the scene at the beginning of a meeting. Even some basic, simple things like, okay, are we all in agreement here that this is a private conversation, for example, that we're not recording anything? Are we all in agreement that we'll have our cameras on, at least for part of the meeting, for example? I think in those situations as well, it's really important to make sure that everybody in the meeting knows why everybody else is in the meeting. So there's not that suspicion as to, well, why are you there? And actually, we do quite a lot of graduate training. And one of the things that graduates, stereotyping a little bit, but a lot of graduates say is that they feel a little bit intimidated in meetings. And they're like, well, I'm the graduate, I'm there to observe, I'm there to make notes, and not to interrupt. And I don't feel it's my place to ask questions. So we always say, well, still it's important that you introduce yourself and explain why you're there. Even if your camera's off, maybe explain why your camera's off. Maybe say, I'm not only here. Sorry, that's terrible. I'm here. It's really important that I'm here to observe and make notes. And that way you're presenting yourself well, you're being appropriately present, but you're turning down your levels of presence because that's appropriate. And so just making sure that everyone knows why everyone's there and what our roles are. But it's being that great host as well, isn't it, when you're leading that meeting? I think about it as being a great conductor, like you're moving, like any great facilitation, you're moving the conversation around. And something that can be really helpful that we always use in our meetings and trainings is just a contribution log, or a learner log, we sometimes call them. So that idea that you've got everyone's name on the list and you just keep it a bit of a track as to who's contributing. Being respectful that some people will want to contribute less than others, of course, that's fine, but just keeping our eye on that. So if they are contributing less, is that because they're not interested, or are they just more of a reflector, or are they multitasking? Because that's worth just keeping our eye on as well. But also we need to manage the over contributors. And what we found is that there are reasons why people might struggle to manage their contribution levels more in a virtual environment than in a face-to-face environment. For example, the visual cues are less obvious in a virtual environment. And for example, we know that one of the reasons some people don't like to speak in a virtual environment is because they're concerned that they'll speak over somebody else, because those cues aren't as obvious. We also know that if you're a little bit uncomfortable, then if you have a preference for extroversion, you're more likely to be extrovert. If your preference is introversion, you're more likely to be more introvert if you're feeling intimidated as well. Then there's the whole Zoom fatigue. I mean, it is a real thing. I know we used it in the beginning of the pandemic to say basically we're sick of family quizzes every Thursday night and friendly quizzes on Sunday. I've got Zoom fatigue. But it is a real thing. So, being on camera and being virtual in meetings all day, which many of us are, it's psychologically tiring because our brains are having to work just a little bit harder to read those visual cues. And also, I found this quite surprising, is there's still an ever such a slight delay in which we don't often consciously notice in, when we're speaking, but subconsciously we're picking up on that and just having to work a bit harder. So I think it's about being aware of all of that. And there are things, I've mentioned a few ideas of overcoming it, but another thing is to say, actually, everyone, for this next conversation, should we all just turn our cameras off?
Yay. Glad you said that one. That is really important. And I love how you were talking there about managing your presence, something like that. You phrased it better. And I think that is so important, and that is a conversation that we need to be having. And I'm going to hammer on this just because the other day I heard someone say they'd been at some webinar or something about hybrid work. And of course, talking about hybrid work, of course, they had to talk about hybrid meetings because that's the first thing people think about, meetings. And how they were saying that, of course, everyone has to have their video on all the time and things like that. And I think that we really need to understand that just the same as we don't expect everyone to be doing exactly the same thing and looking exactly at the same point of reference and exactly the same way when we are in a co-located space, we've got to give that freedom as well in when we are online. And the use of camera needs to be discussed still, I think, because yes, it is wonderful. I mean, I am such an audio person, but when I see people on the screen, I do like it, and I do sometimes they make me smile more. However, for a lot of conversations, I prefer to have my camera off because I'm thinking, because I'm writing, because actually I might be uncomfortable in that conversation. And if I have the camera on all the time, I might be worried about my face. and it's not the same as having a conversation face to face, because there is that pressure that you have to be facing. And in fact, I have had times when, not out of disrespect, but out of curiosity, I might not have been looking attentive, in inverted commas. And I know that somebody has then tried to get me in because they thought I was disengaged, but actually I was just not really looking to where they wanted me to look.
Well, of course, if you've got like dual monitors, you might be looking at one monitor where the slides are or your notes are there. You might be looking down because you're capturing notes, and that's absolutely fine. And I think your point about let's have the conversation is so important. So I prefer to have my camera on because if I don't, I multitask.
Oh, Catherine.
I do. It's like my fingers creep away and I could be really engaged, but the next thing I'm like on my phone checking, I'm like, why did that happen? So I know I'm better behaved if I'm on camera. Sorry, I said it.
But you see, that now this is the thing. So before the pandemic, I had another conversation with someone who said, someone I know doesn't trust their people to work from home because they don't trust themselves to work from home.
Oh, really?
And I think this is it's very similar. It is that maybe we run a meeting and we don't like people not having the camera on because we know that for us is a key point of engagement and attention. Therefore, I think that's really important, that note of self-awareness, and then not assuming that everyone needs the same as you. And then, shifting around.
Yeah, and I confess, that was me. I thought, well, everyone should have their camera on. Why wouldn't they? But I've now learned that for some people, that's just so tiring.
Yeah.
But then, one story I heard. So I know of a few organisations actually that they have said to their employees, please don't ask people to put their cameras on. So people aren't in a position to say, I'm uncomfortable doing that. But then that can have the opposite effect in some cases, because one manager said to me that he has a graduate in his team they joined virtually, and so they've never been in a room together. And for 18 months, he'd never seen his employee because his employee never ever put the camera on, ever. And that worries me as well, because the stuff that we see, from a well-being perspective, the way that somebody is taking care of themselves, some of the small clues sometimes that we pick up by seeing people as to whether they're okay, that worried me as well. So I think with all of this, there's just balance. But if we're having conversations, at least, that's a great start, isn't it?
And balance is the word. It really, really is. And I know I go sometimes one different. The imbalance goes one way, but really the balance between cameras on, not on, between meetings, not meetings, synchronous, asynchronous, going back to the learning experience, balance of different ways, and just really making sure that what we're doing is either the most appropriate or at least the most deliberate choice, rather than going with inertia. And not stopping. And also trying things out and then revisiting them and making that time. Of course, making time, I know, is always really difficult, but we can have then these kind of issues. Like I mean, the example was so great. Thanks, Catherine. So great. Okay, we've covered a lot, I think. But what the last thing that I would like you to share with me and listeners, and I love having a podcast because I'm really curious. So, how have you, in your company, changed how you work, either internally? What are some of the things that you've changed as a result of all the thinking, adjustment, experimenting that you've been doing recently?
That's great. I love the fact that you use the word experimenting, because it's always an experiment, isn't it? We've been taking some inspiration from some of the podcasts that we've been listening to from you, actually, Pilar, about asynchronous and synchronous. And working out loud and grappling with, well, what does that mean for us? What does that mean for us? And one of the things, one of the things, it's a small thing that occurred to us is, so we live on Teams, like literally everyone says good morning, goodbye. And then every meeting we're on Teams. And what occurred to me is that we're all trying to be good citizens and have like focus time. And you can put on Teams, that you're busy or do not disturb. And then people know that. But the problem is if you've put yourself on do not disturb for the morning, Pilar, because you've got a really important deadline to hit, but I've got a burning question for you. Now, it's burning enough that I don't want to forget to ask you, but it's not that urgent that it couldn't wait. But I'll forget to ask you if I don't send it straight away. Yes. But then even if I send it, even if you're on Do Not Disturb, still, we all know that we just can't help just check in our messages every now and then, especially if you're a multitasker like me. And then even if you don't respond, it's just still knocked your focus a little bit. So we've just, we just learned internally that we can delay messages on Teams. So you can schedule a response in Teams to go whenever you think is best for that other person. So it's like, hey, let's do this. So we shared that. We've been sharing ways of being more intentional about meetings. So we've all changed our Outlook calendars so that you can have So when you set like a half-hour meeting, it sets to default to 25 minutes. Or if you set an hour meeting, it sets by default to 50, so that it's harder to book back-to-back meetings, because we were terrible at that. The other thing that's come up recently, which I found, again, really interesting, was this idea of flex. So we say to all of our team, hey, look, we operate a flexible working policy here. And I thought, well, isn't that great? It's like really straightforward. So if you work for me, what that means is I'm pretty cool. You do what you want. If you want to go to the dentist or go and, have 2 hours for lunch and enjoy the sunshine, that's great. But what we discovered is that that's great for me, but still people want structure around flexibility.
Yeah.
So I can flex, but within what reason? So we're experimenting. It is an experiment. We literally just launched it this week, where we said, okay, and this hurts me to say this, but we're experimenting core hours. So core hours are 10 till 3. Outside of that, do whatever you want. But we can still flex within that, go to the dentist, all that. So we're trying to work out to give people, I think everyone wants that comfort level that they can flex, but within the parameters of what's fair and reasonable. Yeah. And no one ever, and the thing is, no one ever goes beyond what's reasonable. If anything, they're more likely to hold back a little bit. So yeah, if any listeners have got ideas on that, that's definitely something that we're experimenting with.
Yeah, that's a really good point, this fact of you could do what you want. That's really hard, because then you're second guessing what really is acceptable and what, because there's always boundaries. Even if we say there aren't any, there are boundaries, because especially if we've been in the workplace for a certain time, there are boundaries, and it's the same as the unlimited holidays thing, where they found that many companies they've introduced these, but nobody's really taken them because everyone is like, well, so it's actually better to say, well, you can take a maximum of doist, I think, have like 40 days a year, which is great. Yeah, so it's and the all the experimenting with, because as soon as you don't have core hours, then you're really relying on asynchronous communication. And for some teams and some personalities, you want that real time. You want to feel almost that people are there with you during work, and they might not be sitting next to you, and you might not have your cameras open, and you're not talking all the time. But it's just that sense that, as you say, if I want to know that people are there working at the same time as me, it just helps me. Yeah. I don't know.
Well, we had a period last summer where it was that glorious weather that we had. But we had loads of our team were like, great, I'm going to start work at 7, finish at 3, and then I've got like the rest of the day. But I wish I was an early riser. I'm not. So I was working like 9 till 5, well, beyond. I rarely worked the actual hours. But I found that it's like 4 hours of the working day where we weren't together. So that's a limited amount of time we could have meetings. And there was like 2 of us working between 3 and 5. It's like, where is everybody else? So yeah, again, it comes back to your point from earlier. It's about balance. It's about conversation. It's about experimentation. It's about applying a bit of common sense and saying, well, let's try this. If it doesn't work, that's okay. That's not failure. We've just found a way that doesn't work. That's positive. It's learning. It's progress. Let's try something new.
And also, especially, and this coming from someone who's all the time, pontificating about stuff. Don't worry too much about what other people are doing. Find your own way. But also in this experimentation, we get clarity. And this was the whole reason why I went into the virtual space, because I thought we needed to have these conversations when we do it gradually. And in doing that, we really start to understand how we work together. And again, we just start to understand each other better, and we can then do things by choice and not by inertia.
Yeah, it comes back to that point again from earlier about being intentional.
Yeah, great. Good. Well, Catherine, this has been really, really wonderful. And I'm sure that listeners might want to connect with you, find out more about you, even work with you. I know you're still active on LinkedIn, aren't you? Is that your preferred social media platform, or have you got others?
We're on others, but probably LinkedIn's the easiest way to find me. Just put in Catherine with a C, Nicholson, and you will probably find me. It's the virtual training team.
Excellent. And let's direct them to the website, which is virtualtrainingteam.co.uk. Excellent. Well, thank you very much. It's lovely to speak to you.
Oh, thank you, Pilar. As always, love it.
Before we go, let's just do the very first line again, because you said something really strange.
What did I? Oh, I'm happy. Yeah, I know.
I'm happy to have me. I don't know what it was. big thank you for listening to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast produced by Virtual Not Distant. If you have something to add to the conversation, let us know through the contact form over at virtualnotdistant.com. I have been your host, Pilar Orti, and I'm signing off now. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, enjoy.